This is the first of our lectures on Sartre and existentialism. In our first lecture, we're going to discuss the main themes of existentialism, and they are atheism, subjectivity, contingency, freedom, and responsibility. Let us start our thinking about Sartre at the end of the book, on the last page. Even in the last paragraph, in which Sartre explains that existentialism, a 20th century philosophy of human being, is an atheism. An atheism. It is not the usual kind of atheism that offers reasons for why God does not exist, or why we cannot know whether God exists. The first one is a metaphysical argument about existence. The second is an epistemological argument about knowledge. Sartre claims that even if God exists, not that the existentialist thinks that God exists, then it does not make any difference. A less intuitive claim than we would expect. What can Sartre mean by that? To put it simply, in terms of existentialism's central concern, Sartre's point is that human beings would still be responsible for all their actions as the creators of values, according to which they act and according to which they can be judged. Whether I steal or don't steal, whether I murder or don't murder, whether I live my life as a philosopher or not, whether I live my life as a married person or not, whether I engage in adultery or not, whether I'm good to my friends or not. Sartre's claim is that the goodness of those things is just something that we create by choosing them, that there are no external values according to which any of that is right or wrong. Just what the person chooses makes it right or wrong in that person's life. What they choose is right, and what they didn't choose is not. That's the sort of a thing we're talking about when we're talking about values, purposes, and meaning of existence. The meaning of existence is just what one makes it by making the choices that one does, thus outlining certain things as good and other things as not good. That is the meaning of existence. All right, so one more time. To put it simply, in terms of existentialism's central concern, Sartre's point is that human beings would still be responsible for all their actions as the creators of values, according to which they act and according to which they can be judged. That is also to say that human beings are the only ones that give meaning and purpose to their lives by creating meaning and purpose in their lives, by creating it, rather than finding values and meanings and purposes outside. And if they conform to those, then their lives are good and meaningful and purposeful. And if they don't, then their lives are not. Right? The point here is that human beings create those values and meanings and purposes that distinguish between what is good and right and what is not. So, in a sense, a human being really can be wrong in doing whatever it does. And the traditional understanding of God as the creator of all there is, and certainly as the creator of what there is ultimately, God creates values and meanings and purposes for human beings as the creator of human beings and the universe and its order. In this sense, by claiming that each human being creates rather than finds values, meaning, and purpose in their lives, not God, existentialism is an atheism. Even if there is God, we don't have access to God in such a way that God creates values, meanings, and purposes for us, what we should and should not do. But our human situation is such that each person is only aware of themselves as creators of values, meanings, and purposes in their lives. That is what Sartre means by the second statement about human existence from the standpoint of existentialism. Human existence is subjectivity in addition to atheism. Subjectivity is this being incapable of escaping beyond beliefs formed by one's situation and by one's choices in those situations. We have access to nothing other than ourselves, each person for themselves, as the source of values, meanings, and purposes, what is right and good for each individual. For that reason, we come to the third statement about human existence. Each person is absolutely responsible for themselves, and no one and no thing, not nature, society, or even God, can relieve us of this responsibility by offering us answers as to what we should do. Of course, answers are out there. All kinds of people claim that there are answers as to what we should do as they receive these answers from God, nature, and so on. But the thought is that we don't have to believe them. And even if we do believe them, then we choose to believe them. And we choose to believe them according to our own values, meanings, and purposes that we have already formed as a result of being in the situations that we have been and choosing in those situations. So we're always just reproducing our own values, even when we select someone else as speaking the truth about what's good and right. That's the existentialist Sartrean argument. Of course, there are thinkers, and many philosophers are among them, even those that we have studied, Aristotle, Kant, Mill, who argued that nature, whether physical or rational, is the source of meaning, value, and purpose for all of us as human beings. There are also religious thinkers who argue that God determines values, meanings, and purposes for human beings. All of these thinkers are theists in broad terms, against whom Sartre claims that each human being is the source of values, meanings, and purposes in their lives, and there can be no other. But what is Sartre's argument for this position? We can construe Sartre's argument in two complementary ways. Each person is a product of their social and historical circumstances and cannot transcend them. Each one of us knows that our beliefs about values, meanings, and purposes, as given to us by society, religion, parents, etc., are the product of our circumstances. And if we were born into other circumstances, we would have different beliefs about values, meanings, and purposes. We know that our values, meanings, and purposes are as they are because they just happen to be as they are as a result of our situations. And they could be completely different if we were born into other situations. In this sense, our values, meanings, and purposes are arbitrary and contingent. as they may as well have been completely other. But at the same time, we have no access to values, meanings, and purposes beyond such arbitrary and contingent ones. Any claims about absolute and necessary values, meanings, and purposes are themselves dependent on the arbitrary and contingent contexts of their origin, and are therefore themselves arbitrary and contingent, and are not in any way absolute and necessary. That is the first argument, based on our understanding of contingency and arbitrariness of our circumstances and beliefs emergent in those circumstances. The second argument is that we, after all, are aware of this contingency and arbitrariness and are, in that sense, beyond them. We question our own contingent and arbitrary values, meanings, and purposes, and all that we know. But is any of this really true in the sense of necessity and absoluteness? Are any of the values that we already have true in the sense of necessity and absoluteness? But in our questioning of all there is, we do not and cannot find any answers beyond contingency and arbitrariness of all answers. Sartre argues that what that means is that we then have to choose and thereby create for ourselves our values, purposes, and meanings. And that choice is open. We may as well choose one or another set of values, since it is an individual's choice itself that gives any kind of validity to values, purposes, and meanings, not society, nature, or God. In that sense, we are both free to choose anything as our values and are responsible for those choices. I am free to choose whether to be a murderer or a non-murderer, a thief or a non-thief, to be an honest person or a liar. And by making those choices, I make those things good in my life. And of course, I could have chosen the exact opposites. But I have chosen as I have chosen as a result of being in the situations I have been and the choices that I have made. Though I could have made other choices in those situations. It may seem that we can forego choosing by simply continuing with values, purposes, and meanings that have already been implanted in us by our upbringing and situations. But since we do not have to continue in that mode, once we realize and how contingent and arbitrary it is, we choose it by refusing to choose any other. Even when we seem not to choose, we choose and are absolutely free and responsible in doing so. Those are the only absolutes in the midst of all this, our freedom and responsibility. We choose even when we choose not to choose. It's Sartre's point. Even when we don't choose, we choose not to choose. But this freedom and responsibility are difficult and a burden. And as soon as we recognize that we are ultimately free and responsible for ourselves, we tend to want to disavow these freedom and responsibility by attempting to hide behind some authority that would seem to create meanings, values, and purposes for us, society, nature, or God. Sartre proposes that existentialism is a reminder of what we already know. Ultimately, there are no such authorities, and each person creates in freedom their values, meanings, and purposes for themselves, and is responsible for them. Each one of us knows that at each moment we must choose whether to continue with values, meanings, and purposes that we have at the moment, or choose new ones. And that ultimately, we do not know which one is superior. At each moment, I choose to continue my life as a white male, straight, married, left leaning philosophy professor in New York State. Or I can choose to live an entirely different life according to other values, meanings, and purposes. The very opposite of what I have chosen so far. There are deep reasons for what I have chosen so far, but I can also just choose other options because I'm free. And from the standpoint of my freedom, any of the options are as good. Of course, I have chosen to live my life in that way according to the limited options that were available to me in my past and in my situations. But at each moment, there were other options also available, and I could also have chosen those. And it is still and will always be the case that there are options from which I am free to choose any any choices, and there are no wrong choices, and whatever choice I make is the right choice, since there are no ultimate standards other than those which I create by my choices and from which my choices can be evaluated. Clearly, some choices are more difficult than others as a result of the choices I have already made, but I need not choose ease and convenience or even happiness itself as the criterion by which I, as a free and responsible being, make my choices. What is happiness to freedom? Freedom is being free whether to choose happiness or something else. It's not an ultimate value by any means, from the standpoint of freedom, which Kant was already suggesting, but Aristotle was not at all. Because for Aristotle, we are beings of nature rather than freedom. As a white, male, straight, married, left leaning philosophy professor in New York State, I'm on a certain path and have a certain trajectory, on the way of which certain choices are good and others are bad, but I can change that trajectory at any moment. And then other choices will come into light as good or bad. Nothing, except my own choosing, stops me from choosing to live my life in an entirely different way. And I am responsible for choosing to live my life as I do. That responsibility is not so easy. And there's a temptation to hide behind that nature, society, history, circumstances choose for me what is good and right for me. But Sartre argues we all know that all of that is false and that we are simply pretending, attempting to pretend that it is not. Ultimately, Sartre argues this dilemma of beings aware of themselves and contingent of their own ultimately arbitrary creations is there only for conscious, rational, and self-reflective beings with the power of imagination to imagine and conceive everything as other than it appears to be. That is our human consciousness, and all of these reflections are its product. Just as for Aristotle, the big deal about us was nature, for Kant, it was our rationality, for Mill, also nature in its own way. For Sartre, it is that we are conscious beings, that everything comes to light for us as it does. To be conscious of something is to be conscious of that it doesn't have to be as it is. And thus, whatever we are conscious of is conscious in the mode of radical arbitrariness and radical contingency. To become conscious of that my hand is here is also to become conscious of that My hand doesn't have to be here. I can move it away. Nor did it have to be here in the first place. I could have chosen not to put my hand here at all. We are conscious beings with a power of imagination, on the basis of which we are able to question everything and anything and not really find answers out there. But we provide answers by choosing answers as answers to our questions.